The bar was thick with smoke, and the smell of cheap beer when Sarah Martinez walked through the heavy wooden door. She had just finished another brutal day at Naval Special Warfare training, where the instructors seemed to take special pleasure in making her life miserable. Her muscles ached from the endless push-ups, her lungs burned from the underwater drills, and her pride was battered from the constant reminders that she didn't belong. At 24, Sarah stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed less than most of the gear her male counterparts carried on their backs. She had earned her way into the most elite military training program in the world, but that didn't stop the whispers that followed her everywhere she went. The other trainees called her Deadweight when they thought she couldn't hear, though some weren't even trying to hide it anymore. The Anchor's Rest was the kind of dive bar that military personnel flocked to after hard days. It sat just outside the base, with dim lighting, worn leather booths, and a jukebox that hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Sarah had never been inside before tonight, but she needed somewhere to think, somewhere to decide if she was going to quit or keep fighting. She ordered a Coke and found a corner table, trying to make herself invisible. That lasted about 10 minutes before she heard the familiar laugh of Petty Officer Jake Morrison, one of her biggest tormentors from training. He was sitting at the bar with 3 other SEAL candidates, already several beers deep and getting louder by the minute. "Look what the cat dragged in," Morrison announced, his voice cutting through the bar's chatter. "Little Sarah Martinez, probably here to cry into her juice box about how mean we are to her." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes on her drink. She had learned early in training that responding to provocations only made things worse. The instructors would punish the entire class if anyone started a fight, and somehow it always ended up being her fault. Morrison wasn't done. "You know what I heard today? I heard she couldn't even complete the rope climb during morning PT, had to get help from 2 instructors just to make it halfway up." This was a lie, but the other men laughed anyway. "Maybe she should try out for the Coast Guard," one of his friends suggested. "I hear they have lower standards for their rescue swimmers." Another voice joined in. "Or maybe she could be a Navy cook. At least then when she can't carry her own weight, people just go hungry instead of dying." Sarah felt her face burning with embarrassment and anger. She had completed every single training exercise, often performing better than half the men in her class. Just last week, she had been one of only 3 candidates to successfully complete the underwater navigation course on the first try. But none of that mattered when the narrative had already been written about her. She stood up to leave, but Morrison's voice stopped her. "Where you going, Deadweight? Training's not until tomorrow morning. You planning to get some extra beauty sleep? Trust me, it's not working." The entire bar had gone quiet now, sensing the tension building. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do. Some of the patrons were active duty SEALs who had graduated from the same program she was struggling through. Their opinions could make or break her military career. "I'm going home," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her chest. "Home to Mommy and Daddy." Morrison stood up from his bar stool, swaying slightly. "Did you tell them how their little princess is washing out of SEAL training, how she's making the rest of us look bad just by being there?" "Sit down, Morrison," one of the older SEALs at another table said firmly. "You've had enough." But Morrison was past caring about consequences. "No, I think everyone needs to hear this. This little girl is going to get real operators killed someday because she can't pull her own weight. She's a diversity hire, nothing more. A publicity stunt for the Navy to show how progressive they are." Sarah's vision went red around the edges. She had endured months of this treatment, telling herself it would get better, that she just needed to prove herself. But Morrison had crossed a line by suggesting she would get people killed. Her brother had died serving his country, and she had entered the military to honor his memory and protect others the way he had tried to protect his unit in Afghanistan. "Take it back," she said, her voice low and dangerous. Morrison laughed. "Or what? You'll file a complaint with the Equal Opportunity Office. Run crying to your instructors about how the mean boys won't play nice with you." "I said take it back." Sarah took a step forward, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Make me Deadweight." What happened next would be talked about in military circles for years to come. Sarah didn't throw the first punch, but when Morrison shoved her backward into a table, she responded with the kind of violence that her training had taught her. The problem was, Morrison and his friends had received the same training. The fight that erupted was brutal and chaotic. Tables were overturned, beer bottles shattered, and multiple people were thrown to the ground. Sarah found herself surrounded by 4 larger, stronger opponents, but she fought with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. Morrison came at her first, throwing a wild haymaker that she ducked under before driving her knee into his solar plexus. He doubled over, gasping for air, but one of his friends grabbed her from behind, pinning her arms to her sides. She drove her head backward into his nose, feeling the cartilage crunch and hearing him scream in pain. The third man tried to tackle her around the waist, but Sarah had been preparing for this moment her entire military career. She had studied every martial arts manual she could get her hands on, practiced fighting techniques until they became second nature, and conditioned her body to withstand punishment that would break most people. She sprawled backward, using the man's momentum against him and sending him crashing into the bar. Bottles fell and shattered around them as she spun to face the fourth attacker, who was reaching for a broken beer bottle to use as a weapon. "That's enough." The voice belonged to Master Chief Petty Officer Robert Hayes, a legendary SEAL who had been quietly drinking at the end of the bar. He stood up slowly, his presence immediately commanding respect from everyone in the room. "All of you stand down, now." The fight stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Morrison was still on his knees, struggling to breathe. His friend with the broken nose was leaning against a wall, blood streaming down his face. The man who had tried to tackle Sarah was pulling himself up from the floor, shards of glass in his hair. Sarah stood in the center of the destruction, her lips split and her knuckles bloody, but she was the only one still standing and ready to fight. Her chest heaved with adrenaline and exhaustion, but her eyes remained locked on Morrison, daring him to get up and continue what he had started. Master Chief Hayes walked over slowly, his boots crunching on broken glass. He looked around at the damage, then at the 4 men who had started the fight, and finally at Sarah. His expression was unreadable, but there was something that might have been approval in his eyes. "Petty Officer Martinez," he said formally, "you'll report to my office at 800 tomorrow morning." "Yes, Master Chief," she replied, snapping to attention despite her injuries. He turned to Morrison and his friends. "You 4 will also be in my office at 800, and you'll be paying for the damages to this establishment." He looked around the bar one more time. "This incident will be investigated fully. Anyone who has a problem with that can speak to me directly." The Master Chief walked out of the bar without another word, leaving behind a room full of stunned silence. Sarah picked up her jacket from where it had fallen and headed for the door, ignoring the stares from the other patrons. As she reached the exit, she heard one of the older SEALs talking quietly to his friend. "Did you see how she handled herself? 4 against 1 and she was winning." Morrison's lucky the Master Chief stopped it when he did. That little girl was about to tear him apart. Sarah stepped out into the cool night air, her body beginning to feel the full extent of her injuries. Her left shoulder was already stiffening up, and she was pretty sure she had cracked a rib when one of Morrison's friends had grabbed her from behind. But for the first time since beginning SEAL training, she felt like she had proven something important. She had shown that she wouldn't back down, that she could fight when cornered, and that being underestimated was sometimes an advantage. The men who had called her Deadweight had learned that she was anything but dead weight when it came to defending herself and her honor. As she walked back to the barracks, Sarah knew that tomorrow would bring consequences for her actions. There would be disciplinary hearings, official reprimands, and probably extra training designed to punish her for fighting. But she also knew that something fundamental had changed tonight. The other candidates would never look at her the same way again. Some would respect her more for standing up to Morrison and his crew. Others would resent her for proving that their assumptions about her were wrong. But none of them would ever call her Deadweight again, at least not to her face. More importantly, Sarah had proven something to herself. She belonged in this program not because the Navy needed to fill a diversity quota, but because she had the heart of a warrior. She was willing to fight for what she believed in, even when the odds were stacked against her. The road ahead was still long and difficult. SEAL training was designed to break people down and rebuild them into something stronger, and being involved in a bar fight wouldn't make that process any easier. But Sarah Martinez was no longer just surviving the program. She was beginning to understand that she might actually have what it took to complete it. As she reached the barracks and quietly slipped inside, she thought about her brother Miguel, who had died protecting his fellow soldiers from an IED in Afghanistan. He would have been proud of her tonight, not for starting a fight, but for finishing one that others had forced upon her. She had honored his memory by refusing to back down when bullies tried to break her spirit. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time since beginning the most difficult training program in the military, Sarah Martinez went to sleep feeling like she truly belonged. The alarm clock screamed at 5:30, but Sarah was already awake. She had been lying in her narrow bunk for the past hour, staring at the ceiling and preparing herself for what was coming. Her ribs ached with every breath, and her split lip had swollen during the night, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the anxiety gnawing at her stomach. Master Chief Hayes had a reputation that preceded him throughout the entire naval special warfare community. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and had been awarded the Navy Cross for actions that were still classified. When he spoke, even the most senior officers listened. When he was disappointed in someone, their military career was essentially over. Sarah pulled herself out of bed and looked in the mirror. Her reflection showed a young woman with a purple bruise covering half her face, dried blood under her fingernails, and eyes that looked older than her 24 years. She had joined the Navy to make a difference, to prove that women could serve their country in combat roles, and to honor her brother's memory. Now she was about to find out if one night of violence had destroyed all of those dreams. The walk to Master Chief Hayes' office felt like a death march. Other candidates she passed in the hallways either avoided eye contact completely or stared at her with mixtures of respect and fear. Word of the bar fight had spread through the base like wildfire, with each retelling making the story more dramatic than the last. By the time she reached the Master Chief's office, the story had grown to include her single-handedly defeating 8 men while blindfolded and juggling flaming torches. The reality had been much simpler and more terrifying. 4 trained killers had tried to break her spirit, and she had refused to let them succeed. Master Chief Hayes' office was spartanly decorated with only a few photos, his awards, and a bookshelf filled with military manuals and biographies of famous warriors. He was sitting behind his desk when she knocked, reading what appeared to be her service record. Without looking up, he told her to enter and take a seat. "Petty Officer Martinez," he began, his voice carrying the authority of 25 years in the Navy. "Would you care to explain to me why I received phone calls at 200 this morning from 3 different commanding officers, 2 military police investigators, and the owner of a bar who wants someone to pay for his damages?" Sarah sat at attention, her back straight despite the pain in her ribs. "Master Chief, I was defending myself against an unprovoked attack from 4 fellow candidates who were intoxicated and became violent when I attempted to leave the establishment." Hayes finally looked up from her file. His eyes were steel gray and seemed to look directly into her soul. "That's the official version. Now give me the real version." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her honesty in this moment would determine her future. "Master Chief, Petty Officer Morrison and his friends have been harassing me since the beginning of training. Last night, they escalated their harassment to physical assault when I refused to engage with their verbal provocations. I defended myself using the hand-to-hand combat techniques that the Navy taught me." "And you felt that starting a bar fight was an appropriate response to verbal harassment?" "No, Master Chief, but I felt that defending myself when physically attacked was not only appropriate but necessary to maintain my safety and honor." Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying her face. The silence stretched between them for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, he spoke again. "I've been in this office for 6 hours this morning, Martinez. I've reviewed security footage from the bar, interviewed witnesses, and read statements from everyone involved. I've also had very interesting conversations with Morrison and his 3 friends." Sarah's heart pounded as she waited for the verdict that would end her military career. "According to the video evidence, you were physically assaulted first. According to witness statements, you attempted to leave the situation multiple times before it escalated to violence. According to Morrison's own admission, he and his friends specifically targeted you for harassment based on your gender and their belief that you don't belong in this program." The Master Chief stood up and walked around his desk, leaning against the front edge so he could look directly at her. "What concerns me, Petty Officer Martinez, is not that you defended yourself. What concerns me is that you felt you had to handle this situation alone instead of reporting the harassment through proper channels." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Master Chief, I didn't want to be seen as weak or unable to handle the pressure of the program. I thought if I could just prove myself through performance, the harassment would stop. And how did that work out for you? Not well, Master Chief. Hayes nodded slowly. Let me tell you something about this program, Martinez. We're not here to create individual heroes. We're here to create team members who can trust each other with their lives. When Morrison and his friends decided to target you based on prejudice rather than performance, they demonstrated that they can't be trusted with the lives of their teammates. Sarah's eyes widened as she began to understand where this conversation was heading. Morrison, Patterson, Williams, and Brooks have been removed from the SEAL candidate program as of 600 this morning. They're being transferred to other units where their attitudes might be more appropriate, though I doubt any commanding officer will be happy to receive them. The relief that flooded through Sarah's body was so intense that she felt dizzy. She had expected to be court-martialed or at least kicked out of the program. Instead, her tormentors were the ones being punished. That doesn't mean you're off the hook, Hayes continued. Fighting in a bar, regardless of the circumstances, is conduct unbecoming of a naval special warfare candidate. You'll be restricted to base for the next 30 days. You'll perform 100 hours of community service, and you'll write a 5,000-word essay on conflict resolution and leadership under pressure. Yes, Master Chief. Thank you, Master Chief. Don't thank me yet. I'm also assigning you to a new training partner, someone who will challenge you in ways that Morrison and his friends never could. The door to the office opened, and a woman entered who looked like she could bench press a small car. She was tall, muscular, and moved with the confident grace of someone who had never met a physical challenge she couldn't overcome. Her uniform bore the insignia of a senior chief petty officer and the trident pin that marked her as a graduate of SEAL training. Martinez, meet Senior Chief Amanda Rodriguez. She's one of the first women to successfully complete SEAL training, and she's going to be your mentor for the remainder of the program. Rodriguez extended her hand to Sarah, who shook it and immediately felt like her fingers were being crushed by a mechanical vice. I've been watching your progress, Martinez. You have potential, but you also have a lot to learn about working within the system instead of against it. Sarah nodded eagerly. The idea of having a mentor who understood the unique challenges she faced as a woman in SEAL training was beyond anything she had hoped for. Your training schedule is going to change, starting today, Rodriguez continued. You'll be participating in advanced hand-to-hand combat training, leadership seminars, and specialized water operations that most candidates don't see until much later in the program. The goal is to accelerate your development so that you graduate with the same capabilities as someone who's been in the program for twice as long. Master Chief Hayes returned to his seat behind the desk. The bar fight last night demonstrated that you have the warrior spirit necessary to succeed in this program, Martinez. But being a SEAL is about more than just being willing to fight. It's about knowing when to fight, how to fight, and most importantly, how to lead others into battle. Over the following weeks, Sarah's training intensified beyond anything she had experienced before. Senior Chief Rodriguez pushed her to limits she didn't know existed, both physically and mentally. Where her previous instructors had focused on breaking down candidates to rebuild them, Rodriguez focused on identifying and developing Sarah's existing strengths. During hand-to-hand combat training, Rodriguez taught her how to use her smaller size and lower center of gravity as advantages against larger opponents. Morrison and his friends learned the hard way that technique beats brute force, Rodriguez explained after watching Sarah flip a candidate who outweighed her by 80 pounds. But in a real combat situation, you won't have the luxury of a fair fight. You need to be prepared to win quickly and decisively. The leadership training was even more challenging than the physical conditioning. Rodriguez presented Sarah with complex scenarios where she had to make life-or-death decisions for imaginary teams under extreme pressure. Some scenarios had no right answers, only degrees of wrong, forcing Sarah to learn how to live with the consequences of her choices. A good leader takes responsibility for everything their team does or fails to do, Rodriguez explained during one particularly brutal session, where Sarah's hypothetical decisions had resulted in multiple casualty scenarios. A great leader understands that sometimes the best choice available is still going to get people killed, and they have to be able to live with that knowledge while still making the choice. The water operations training was where Sarah truly began to excel. Her smaller lung capacity, which had been seen as a disadvantage in other areas, actually gave her better buoyancy control during underwater navigation exercises. She could move through the water with less disturbance and hold positions that larger candidates found difficult to maintain. During one training exercise, Sarah was tasked with infiltrating a mock enemy position that was guarded by instructors playing the role of sentries. The scenario required her to approach underwater, place simulated explosive charges on a target, and extract without being detected. She completed the mission in record time, moving through the water like a ghost and placing all charges with surgical precision. When she surfaced at the extraction point, she found Rodriguez and Master Chief Hayes waiting for her with stopwatches and broad smiles. 43 minutes and 16 seconds, Rodriguez announced. That's the fastest completion time we've ever recorded for this exercise. Master Chief Hayes nodded approvingly. More importantly, none of the sentries detected your approach or extraction. In a real-world scenario, that kind of performance could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Word of Sarah's performance began to spread throughout the training command. Candidates who had previously ignored her or treated her with open hostility began to seek her out for advice on underwater operations. Some of the instructors who had been skeptical of her abilities began to pay closer attention to her progress. But the most significant change came from within Sarah herself. The bar fight had been a turning point, not just because it had resulted in the removal of her primary tormentors, but because it had forced her to confront the reality of what she was training to become. She wasn't just trying to complete a difficult program. She was preparing to lead others in life-or-death situations. The responsibility of that realization was both terrifying and inspiring. Every training exercise became an opportunity to prove that she could be trusted with the lives of her teammates. Every leadership scenario became a chance to demonstrate that her judgment could be relied upon when everything was on the line. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to understand that the harassment she had endured from Morrison and his friends had actually served a purpose, though not the one they had intended. Their attempts to break her spirit had instead forged it into something stronger and more resilient. Their efforts to prove she didn't belong had forced her to prove that she not only belonged but excelled. The woman who had walked into that bar several weeks ago had been seeking a place to hide from her problems. The woman who emerged from Master Chief Hayes' office that morning was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that she had allies who believed in her potential and the skills necessary to fulfill it. 3 months had passed since the bar fight, and Sarah Martinez had transformed from the uncertain candidate who once doubted her place in SEAL training to one of the most respected members of her class. Under Senior Chief Rodriguez's mentorship, she had not only caught up to her peers, but had begun to excel in areas where even the strongest candidates struggled. The morning sun was barely visible on the horizon when Sarah and her training team gathered on the beach for what their instructors called Hell Week preparation. This wasn't the official Hell Week that would come later in their training, but a practice run designed to identify weaknesses before the real test began. Sarah looked around at her 5 teammates, all men who had initially viewed her with skepticism, but now trusted her with their lives. There was Thompson, a former college football player from Texas who could carry twice his body weight, but relied on Sarah's navigation skills during water operations. Martinez, no relation despite the shared surname, was a former Marine who had initially resented having a woman on the team, but had learned to appreciate her tactical thinking during complex scenarios. The team also included Chen, a computer programmer from California who brought technical expertise but needed Sarah's leadership during high-stress situations. Johnson, a farm boy from Iowa, had incredible endurance but struggled with the mental aspects of SEAL training until Sarah began coaching him through the psychological challenges. Finally, there was Williams, ironically sharing a name with one of the men who had been kicked out after the bar fight, who served as the team's communications specialist and had become one of Sarah's closest allies. Their instructor for this exercise was Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson, a 20-year veteran who had served with distinction in multiple combat theaters. Unlike some of the other instructors who seemed to take pleasure in breaking down candidates, Chief Thompson focused on building teams that could function under impossible circumstances. Today's exercise will test everything you've learned about teamwork, endurance, and decision-making under pressure, Chief Thompson announced as the candidates formed up in the pre-dawn darkness. You'll be operating as a 6-person team with a mission objective that must be completed within 18 hours. He handed Sarah a sealed envelope marked with her team number. As the team leader for this exercise, she would be responsible for planning and executing their mission based on the information contained inside. Your mission briefing is in that envelope, Martinez. You have 30 minutes to review the information, brief your team, and begin execution. Failure to complete the mission within the time limit results in the entire team being recycled through the previous month of training. Sarah's heart raced as she broke the seal on the envelope. Being recycled would mean losing the progress they had all made and potentially missing the window to continue with their current class. More importantly, it would mean failing the 5 men who had learned to trust her leadership. The mission was complex and demanding. Infiltrate a simulated enemy compound, gather intelligence from a specific target, extract a high-value prisoner, and exfiltrate to a designated pickup point 12 miles away. The catch was that they would have to accomplish all of this while carrying full combat gear and operating under simulated combat conditions, with instructors playing the role of enemy forces. "Listen up," Sarah said to her team as she spread out a map of the training area. "We've got multiple objectives and limited time. Our success depends on every one of us performing at peak efficiency and supporting each other when things go wrong." She quickly outlined the mission parameters, assigned specific roles to each team member, and established contingency plans for various scenarios they might encounter. The months of leadership training under Senior Chief Rodriguez had taught her that a good plan executed aggressively was better than a perfect plan that arrived too late. "Questions?" she asked, looking around at her teammates. Thompson raised his hand. "What's our priority if we have to choose between objectives, the intelligence or the prisoner?" It was a good question that highlighted the kind of impossible choices that real-world operators faced. Sarah had wrestled with similar scenarios during her training with Rodriguez, learning that leadership often meant making decisions with incomplete information and living with the consequences. "The prisoner is our primary objective," she decided. "Intelligence is valuable, but we never leave people behind. If we have to choose, we get our guy out and worry about the intel later." The team nodded in agreement, and Sarah felt a surge of confidence from their trust in her judgment. These men had learned to follow her not because regulations required it, but because she had proven herself capable of making the hard decisions that kept teams alive. The first phase of the mission required a 2-mile swim in full gear to reach the target area. This was where Sarah's intensive water training with Rodriguez paid dividends. While her teammates struggled with navigation and buoyancy control in the dark water, she moved through the surf like she had been born in the ocean. "Stay close and follow my lead," she whispered into her waterproof radio as they approached the shore near the enemy compound. "Remember, we're ghosts until we choose not to be." The infiltration phase tested every skill they had developed during months of training. Sarah led her team through a series of security checkpoints using stealth techniques that would have been impossible without perfect coordination. Each man knew exactly where to step, when to move, and how to communicate without sound. When they reached the compound, Sarah split the team into 2 elements. Thompson, Chen, and Johnson would create a diversion at the front entrance, while Sarah, Martinez, and Williams penetrated the rear of the facility to locate their objectives. "Remember, this is a precision operation," she whispered into her radio. "We're not here to start a war. Get in, accomplish the mission, get out." The plan worked perfectly until it didn't. As Sarah's element moved through the compound, they discovered that the intelligence target had been moved to a different location. The prisoner was where they expected, but extracting him would require exposing themselves to enemy observation posts. "Team leader, this is Thompson," came the voice through her earpiece. "We've got a problem. There are more instructors playing enemy forces than we anticipated. Our diversion isn't going to last much longer." Sarah found herself facing exactly the kind of scenario that had been haunting her training. A mission where success required risking lives, and failure meant abandoning someone who was counting on them for rescue. "Martinez, Williams, how long do you need to extract the prisoner?" she asked. 5 minutes, maybe 10 if we run into resistance," came Martinez's response. "Thompson, can you give us 10 minutes? "Negative, team leader. We're about to be overrun. You need to extract now or abort the mission." Sarah felt the weight of command pressing down on her like a physical force. In training scenarios, the consequences of failure were recycled classes and disappointed instructors. In the real world, these decisions meant that families received folded flags instead of returning heroes. "New plan," she said into her radio with a calmness that surprised even her. "Thompson, maintain your position but prepare to withdraw on my command. Martinez, Williams, execute prisoner extraction immediately. All elements converge on extraction point Alpha in 7 minutes." What followed was the most intense 7 minutes of Sarah's military career. Her team moved with a precision and coordination that surprised even the instructors who were observing the exercise. Thompson's element conducted a fighting withdrawal that drew enemy forces away from the prisoner extraction, while Sarah's element completed their objective and began moving toward the extraction point. The exfiltration was a 12-mile movement through hostile territory while carrying an injured prisoner and avoiding enemy patrols. It was here that the months of physical conditioning and team building paid their biggest dividends. When Johnson began to falter under the weight of his gear, Thompson took over his equipment without being asked. When Sarah struggled with exhaustion in the final miles, Martinez and Williams flanked her to provide support. They reached the extraction point with 43 minutes to spare, having completed all mission objectives and brought every team member home safely. As they waited for the simulated helicopter pickup, Sarah looked around at her exhausted but triumphant teammates and realized that something fundamental had changed. These men no longer saw her as a woman trying to prove herself in a male-dominated field. They saw her as their team leader, someone whose judgment they trusted and whose orders they followed because she had earned their respect through competence and character. Chief Thompson appeared at the extraction point as the exercise officially ended. His expression was unreadable as he surveyed the team and checked his stopwatch against the mission parameters. 18 hours and 17 minutes, he announced. Mission objectives completed, all personnel accounted for, no major injuries or safety violations. The team exchanged glances, unsure whether they had passed or failed the exercise. "That was the fastest completion time for this exercise in the history of this training program," Chief Thompson continued. "More importantly, you functioned as a cohesive unit under pressure and made tactical decisions that demonstrated both sound judgment and moral courage." He walked directly up to Sarah, his eyes locked on hers. "Martinez, your leadership during this exercise was exemplary. You made difficult decisions under pressure, adapted to changing circumstances, and brought your entire team home safely. That's what we expect from our operators in the field." The praise from Chief Thompson was worth more than any medal or commendation Sarah could have received. It represented recognition from a warrior who had proven himself in actual combat that she belonged among the elite forces she was training to join. But the most meaningful moment came when Thompson, the football player who had initially doubted her capabilities, stepped forward and offered his hand. "Ma'am," he said formally, "it's been an honor serving under your command. I hope I get the chance to do it again." One by one, the other team members echoed his sentiment. These weren't empty words or politically correct statements. They were genuine expressions of respect from warriors who had seen her perform under pressure and found her worthy of their trust. As they walked back to the barracks together, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The bar fight that had seemed like a career-ending disaster had actually been the catalyst for her transformation from a candidate trying to survive training to a leader worthy of commanding others. She thought about her brother Miguel, whose memory had driven her to join the military in the first place. He would have been proud to see her leading men into battle, making the hard decisions that protected lives and accomplished missions. But more than that, she realized that she had finally found her place in a world that had initially seemed designed to exclude her. She wasn't succeeding despite being a woman. She was succeeding because her unique perspective and capabilities made her team stronger than they could have been without her. The road ahead still held challenges that would test her in ways she couldn't imagine. Hell Week was still coming, followed by advanced training phases that would push her physical and mental capabilities to their absolute limits. But Sarah Martinez was no longer the uncertain candidate who had walked into a bar fight months earlier. She was becoming the kind of leader that others would follow into the darkness, confident that she would bring them home safely or die trying. That transformation from deadweight to team leader was the real victory that no amount of harassment or prejudice could ever take away from her. Hell Week arrived like a storm that everyone could see coming, but no one could truly prepare for. After months of intensive training, Sarah Martinez and her classmates were about to face the ultimate test of their physical endurance, mental toughness, and will to continue when their bodies screamed for them to quit. The week began at sunset on a Sunday, with all remaining candidates gathering on the beach in their standard uniforms. Out of the original class of 48 candidates, only 22 remained. The others had been removed for various reasons: medical issues, academic failures, disciplinary problems, or simply deciding that SEAL training wasn't for them. Sarah stood among the group, her body already aching from the day's preparatory exercises, knowing that the real challenge was about to begin. Senior Chief Rodriguez had spent weeks preparing her for this moment, but no amount of training could fully simulate the physical and psychological assault that Hell Week represented. "Gentlemen," announced Captain James Morrison, the commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Training. The irony of his name, shared with the man who had been kicked out after the bar fight, wasn't lost on Sarah. "And lady," he added with a slight nod in her direction, "welcome to Hell Week." The instructors began blowing horns, setting off fireworks, and shouting orders that sent the candidates scrambling to complete impossible tasks in ridiculous timeframes. This was designed to create immediate stress and confusion, weeding out anyone who couldn't function under extreme pressure. "Get wet and sandy," came the first command, sending all candidates running into the surf fully clothed before rolling in the sand until they looked like human sandwiches. The wet sand would stay with them for days, creating constant friction and discomfort as they moved through subsequent exercises. What followed was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to break the human spirit. The candidates were subjected to continuous physical exercise, sleep deprivation, cold water exposure, and psychological pressure that would have destroyed most people within hours. The goal wasn't to create superhuman soldiers, but to identify individuals who possessed the rare combination of physical toughness and mental resilience necessary for special operations. Sarah's small size, which had been seen as a disadvantage throughout training, actually became an asset during some Hell Week exercises. She required less energy to move her body weight, lost heat more slowly in cold water due to her lower surface area to mass ratio, and could fit through spaces that larger candidates struggled to navigate. During the log exercises, where teams of 6 candidates had to carry telephone poles weighing several hundred pounds while running along the beach, Sarah's technique and coordination helped compensate for her lack of raw strength. She learned to position herself where she could provide maximum leverage, and encouraged her teammates when exhaustion began to cloud their judgment. "Come on, Thompson," she shouted during one particularly brutal log carry as the former football player began to stumble under the combined weight of exhaustion and hypothermia. "Your mama didn't raise you to quit on a Tuesday afternoon." The absurdity of the statement, delivered with complete seriousness while she struggled under a massive wooden beam, actually made Thompson laugh despite his misery. That moment of levity helped the entire team push through another mile of torturous exercise. But Hell Week wasn't just about physical challenges. The instructors used psychological warfare to identify candidates who might break under the mental pressure of combat operations. They would whisper doubts and fears into candidates' ears during brief rest periods, suggest that their teammates were talking about quitting, and create scenarios where success seemed impossible. "Martinez," one instructor said quietly during a brief meal break on the second day, "your teammates are starting to talk. They think you're holding them back during the team exercises. Wouldn't it be easier for everyone if you just rang the bell and went home?" Sarah looked up from her cold meal, her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion but still sharp with determination. "Sir, my teammates can speak for themselves. Until they ask me to leave, I'm staying right here." The instructor smiled and walked away, having confirmed what he already suspected. Sarah Martinez wasn't going to quit, no matter what psychological pressure they applied. The third day brought the dreaded surf torture, where candidates were required to sit linked arm in arm in the frigid Pacific Ocean for hours while waves crashed over their heads. The water temperature was cold enough to cause hypothermia, and several candidates were removed for medical reasons during this exercise. Sarah found herself between Chen and Johnson, both of whom were struggling with the cold and beginning to show signs of hypothermia. She knew that if either of them was removed from training, it would affect the entire team's morale and chances of success. Tell me about home, she said to Chen through chattering teeth as another wave crashed over their heads. Tell me about the worst Chinese food you ever had. It was a ridiculous conversation to have while sitting in freezing ocean water, but it served its purpose. By focusing on something other than their immediate misery, Chen was able to maintain the mental focus necessary to resist hypothermia. Johnson joined in with stories about terrible farm cooking, and soon their section of candidates was actually laughing despite their circumstances. The instructors noticed this, of course. They always noticed when candidates found ways to maintain morale under extreme conditions. Mental toughness was just as important as physical endurance, and Sarah was demonstrating the kind of leadership that kept teams functional when everything seemed hopeless. Day 4 brought the notorious around-the-world exercise, where candidates had to navigate a series of obstacle courses while carrying heavy equipment and completing complex tasks with minimal sleep and nutrition. Many candidates who had survived the first 3 days finally reached their breaking point during this phase. Sarah's team was down to 5 members after Johnson was removed for a stress fracture in his foot. They were required to carry a rubber boat weighing several hundred pounds over a 10-mile course that included sand dunes, rocky terrain, and multiple water crossings. The catch was that they had to complete the course while one team member was designated as a casualty who couldn't assist with carrying the boat. "I'll be the casualty," Thompson volunteered, knowing that his larger size made him the heaviest burden for his teammates to carry. "Negative," Sarah said firmly despite her exhaustion. "Martinez, you're the casualty. Thompson, Chen, Williams, and I will carry you and the boat." Her decision made tactical sense. Martinez was the lightest team member, making him easier to carry, and Thompson's strength was needed for the boat. But the psychological impact was just as important. By designating herself as one of the active carriers despite being the smallest team member, Sarah was demonstrating that she wouldn't ask her teammates to do anything she wasn't willing to do herself. The exercise became a test of pure willpower. Sarah's shoulders screamed with pain as she struggled to carry her portion of the boat's weight across shifting sand and uneven terrain. Her legs felt like rubber, her lungs burned with every breath, and her vision began to blur with exhaustion. But she refused to let go of the boat or ask her teammates to compensate for her fatigue. "Just keep moving," she whispered to herself, echoing the advice Senior Chief Rodriguez had given her months earlier. "One step at a time, one breath at a time. Don't think about the finish line, just think about the next step." Hours later, when they finally crossed the finish line, Sarah collapsed to her knees in the sand, completely spent but victorious. Her teammates gathered around her, equally exhausted but sharing the quiet pride that came from refusing to quit when quitting would have been easier. "That's what I'm talking about," Chief Thompson said as he approached their group. "You just carried a boat and a teammate for 10 miles on no sleep and minimal food. More importantly, you did it as a team. Nobody got left behind, nobody gave up, and nobody let their teammates down." The final day of Hell Week was traditionally the most difficult, as instructors pushed candidates to their absolute limits to identify anyone who might still break under pressure. Sarah and her remaining teammates were subjected to a series of exercises that tested everything they had learned about teamwork, leadership, and mental toughness. The culminating event was a simulated rescue mission where teams had to navigate through hostile territory, locate missing personnel, and extract them while under enemy fire. The scenario was designed to test decision-making under pressure, as teams faced situations where there were no perfect solutions, and every choice carried significant risks. Sarah found herself in command of a multi-team element after several other team leaders were designated as casualties during the exercise. She was responsible for coordinating the actions of 15 exhausted, sleep-deprived candidates who were operating at the edge of their physical and mental capabilities. "Listen up," she said as they prepared for the final phase of the mission. "We've come too far and worked too hard to fail now. Every one of us belongs here, every one of us has earned the right to graduate, and every one of us is going home with our teammates." Her words carried weight because they had been earned through 5 days of shared suffering and mutual support. These men had watched her perform under impossible conditions, seen her refuse to quit when quitting would have been understandable, and learned to trust her judgment when their own thinking was clouded by exhaustion. The mission was successful, though barely. Sarah's element completed all objectives and extracted all personnel, but only after making tactical decisions that demonstrated both competence and moral courage. When faced with the choice between mission completion and the safety of her teammates, she chose her teammates every time. When Hell Week finally ended at sunset on Friday, only 18 candidates remained standing. Sarah was among them, exhausted beyond description, but filled with a quiet pride that would stay with her for the rest of her life. She had proven to herself and everyone around her that she possessed the rare combination of physical toughness, mental resilience, and leadership ability that defined naval special warfare operators. As the surviving candidates were congratulated by the instructors who had spent the week trying to break them, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The bar fight that had seemed like a disaster had actually been the beginning of her transformation into the kind of leader who could guide others through the darkness. Senior Chief Rodriguez approached her as the formal ceremony concluded. "How do you feel, Martinez?" Sarah looked around at her teammates, men who had learned to trust her with their lives, and at the instructors who now saw her as a future SEAL rather than a diversity experiment. "I feel like I belong here," she said simply. Rodriguez smiled. "Good, because the real training is just beginning." Sarah nodded, knowing that Hell Week was only one milestone in a much longer journey. But she also knew that she had crossed a threshold that could never be taken away from her. She was no longer the uncertain candidate who had been called deadweight by men who didn't understand her value. She was becoming the kind of warrior who others would follow into battle, confident that she would lead them home or die trying. The transformation was complete in all the ways that mattered. What remained was to prove herself worthy of the trident pin that represented membership in one of the world's most elite fighting forces. But after Hell Week, Sarah Martinez knew without doubt that she had both the capability and the character to earn that honor. 2 years had passed since Sarah Martinez first walked into the Anchor's Rest and found herself in a bar fight that changed the trajectory of her military career. Now, she stood on the deck of a Navy destroyer somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea, wearing the uniform of a naval special warfare operator and carrying the trident pin that marked her as one of the most elite warriors in the world. The mission briefing room was filled with tension as Sarah and her 5-person team prepared for their first real-world combat operation. Intelligence had identified a terrorist cell operating from a compound in a hostile region, where they were holding 3 American civilians who had been kidnapped from a humanitarian mission. The window for rescue was closing rapidly, as intercepted communications suggested the hostages would be moved within the next 24 hours. "This is not a training exercise," announced Commander Patricia Hayes, the mission commander and Master Chief Hayes' daughter who had followed her father into naval special warfare. "Everything you've trained for over the past 2 years comes down to the next 12 hours. 3 American lives are counting on your ability to perform under pressure." Sarah looked around the briefing room at her teammates, men she had served with since completing SEAL training. Thompson was there, the former football player who had become one of her most trusted allies. Chen remained the technical expert who could solve any electronic problem they encountered. Williams continued to serve as their communications specialist, and they had been joined by Rodriguez, no relation to Senior Chief Rodriguez, who brought explosive ordnance expertise to the team. What made this team special wasn't just their individual capabilities, but the trust they had developed through months of training and smaller operations together. They had learned to function as a single organism, anticipating each other's movements and covering each other's weaknesses without conscious thought. "Martinez," Commander Hayes said, addressing Sarah directly, "you'll be leading this operation. Intelligence suggests the compound has multiple buildings, uncertain numbers of hostiles, and complicated extraction requirements. Your team has full authority to adapt the plan based on conditions on the ground." The weight of command felt different when real lives hung in the balance. During training, mistakes meant failure grades and disappointed instructors. In combat, mistakes meant that families received folded flags and communities lost their heroes. Sarah had trained for this responsibility for 2 years, but actually carrying it was something else entirely. "Roger, ma'am," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "My team will bring those hostages home." The infiltration phase began at 200 hours, with Sarah's team inserting via small boat onto a rocky coastline 10 miles from their target. They moved through hostile territory using night vision equipment and stealth techniques that had been drilled into them through countless training exercises. Sarah led her team through a landscape that seemed designed to kill unwary travelers. Rocky terrain that could break ankles in the darkness, vegetation that concealed natural obstacles, and open areas where enemy patrols could spot them from great distances. But this was exactly the kind of environment they had trained in for months, and her team moved like ghosts through the hostile territory. "Overwatch position established," came the whisper through her earpiece as Thompson reached the high ground that would allow him to provide covering fire during the assault phase. "I have eyes on the compound. Confirm 3 buildings, multiple sentries, and vehicle movement." Sarah studied the compound through her night vision scope, comparing what she could see with the satellite imagery they had studied during mission planning. The intelligence had been accurate about the layout, but there were more guards than expected and signs of increased security that suggested their presence might have been detected. "Change of plan," she whispered to her team through their secure radio system. "Threat level is higher than anticipated. We're going to need a more aggressive approach to ensure hostage safety." The original plan had called for a careful infiltration followed by a surgical strike designed to neutralize threats with minimal noise. But the increased security meant that stealth was less likely to succeed, and any delay could result in hostage execution. "Chen Williams, you'll create a diversion at the front entrance. Use flashbangs and suppressed fire to draw attention away from the main building. Rodriguez, you're with me for hostage extraction. Thompson, you provide overwatch and covering fire as needed." The assault began at 3:47 hours, with Chen and Williams initiating their diversion exactly as planned. The explosion of flashbang grenades and the distinctive sound of suppressed gunfire immediately drew enemy forces away from the building where intelligence suggested the hostages were being held. Sarah and Rodriguez moved through the compound like predators hunting prey, using the confusion created by their teammates to approach their objective undetected. The building was larger than it had appeared in satellite photos, with multiple rooms that would need to be cleared systematically. "2 guards down," Sarah whispered into her radio as she and Rodriguez neutralized the sentries outside the main building. "Beginning building penetration." What they found inside was both better and worse than they had expected. The 3 American hostages were alive and appeared to be unharmed, but they were being held in separate rooms with individual guards. Extracting them would require perfect coordination and split-second timing. "I count 6 tangos inside the building," Rodriguez whispered. 2 guards per hostage, but they're spread throughout the structure. We'll need to move fast to prevent anyone from executing hostages when the shooting starts. Sarah's mind raced through tactical options, weighing risks against potential outcomes. Every choice carried the possibility of catastrophic consequences, but inaction guaranteed that the hostages would be moved to a location where rescue might be impossible. "We go simultaneous," she decided. "Flashbang the main room, then split up. You take the eastern corridor, I'll take the western. Neutralize guards first, secure hostages second. Speed and precision are everything." The next 60 seconds unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of violence and rescue. Sarah's flashbang grenade detonated in the main room, temporarily blinding and deafening the guards, while she and Rodriguez burst through different entrances. Sarah found herself face-to-face with 2 armed guards who were reaching for their weapons when her suppressed rifle fired twice. Both men dropped without having the chance to threaten their hostage, a middle-aged woman who worked for an international relief organization. "American military," Sarah said quickly to the terrified woman. "We're here to get you home. Stay low and follow my instructions exactly." Meanwhile, Rodriguez was encountering more resistance in his corridor. The guards there had recovered more quickly from the flashbang and were returning fire when Thompson's sniper rifle began engaging targets through the building's windows. "Martinez, Rodriguez needs assistance," came Thompson's voice through the radio. "Multiple tangos converging on his position." Sarah faced the kind of decision that defined leadership under fire: stay with her secured hostage and ensure her safety, or leave her to assist Rodriguez and risk both their lives. It was exactly the scenario she had trained for with Senior Chief Rodriguez months earlier. "Ma'am, I need you to stay right here and don't move until I come back for you," Sarah told her hostage. "Can you do that for me?" The woman nodded, her eyes wide with terror but showing the kind of courage that had led her to work in dangerous regions in the first place. Sarah moved through the building like a force of nature, her rifle engaging threats with surgical precision while she maneuvered to support Rodriguez's position. The close-quarters battle skills that had been drilled into her during training took over, allowing her to process threats and respond faster than conscious thought. She found Rodriguez pinned down by enemy fire while trying to extract two male hostages from a back room. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly as more guards responded to the sounds of combat, and the window for successful extraction was closing. "Cover me," Sarah said into her radio before charging directly at the enemy position, her rifle firing continuously as she advanced through what should have been certain death. Her aggressive assault caught the guards by surprise, allowing Rodriguez to complete the hostage extraction while she dealt with the immediate threats. "All hostages secured," Rodriguez announced. "But we've got more problems. Vehicle convoy approaching from the south. Looks like reinforcements." Sarah's radio crackled with updates from her external team members. Chen and Williams were still maintaining their diversionary attack, but they were running low on ammunition and facing increasing resistance. Thompson reported that the approaching convoy included heavy weapons that could turn the tactical situation against them. "Time to go," Sarah announced. "Execute extraction plan Charlie. All elements converge on Rally Point Alpha in 3 minutes." The extraction was a running battle through hostile territory with 3 terrified civilians who had no military training and were struggling to keep up with the pace necessary for survival. Sarah found herself literally carrying one of the hostages, an elderly man who had been weakened by his captivity, while directing her team's movement through increasingly dangerous terrain. "Thompson, we need covering fire on the ridge line," she called into her radio while helping the elderly hostage over a rocky outcropping. "Chen, Williams, fall back to Rally Point Alpha and prepare for helicopter extraction." The next 20 minutes tested every skill Sarah had developed during 2 years of intensive training. She had to function simultaneously as a warrior engaging enemy forces, a leader coordinating her team's actions, and a protector ensuring the safety of 3 civilians who were completely dependent on her for survival. When the extraction helicopter finally appeared on the horizon, Sarah felt a relief so intense that her knees nearly buckled. But the mission wasn't complete until everyone was safely aboard the aircraft and flying away from hostile territory. "All personnel and hostages aboard," Thompson announced as the helicopter lifted off. "Mission successful." Sarah looked around the aircraft at her teammates and the 3 Americans they had risked their lives to save. The elderly man she had carried was receiving medical attention but appeared to be stable. The relief worker was comforting one of her colleagues who had been injured during his captivity. All 3 hostages were alive and would be reunited with their families within hours. "Outstanding work, team leader," came the voice of Commander Hayes through Sarah's headset. "Flawless execution under extremely difficult circumstances. The families of those hostages owe you their lives." As the helicopter flew towards safety, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years earlier, she had been a candidate struggling to prove herself worthy of the most elite military training in the world. Tonight, she had led a team into combat and brought everyone home safely. The men who had once called her Deadweight would have been forced to acknowledge that she had become exactly what they had claimed she could never be, a warrior capable of leading others in life-or-death situations. But more importantly, she had proven to herself that the dreams that had driven her to join the military were achievable through dedication, courage, and the willingness to never give up. Her brother Miguel would have been proud to see her tonight, leading American warriors into battle to protect innocent lives. The bar fight that had once seemed like a career-ending disaster had actually been the catalyst for her transformation into the kind of leader who could make the hard decisions when everything was on the line. As the helicopter crossed into friendly airspace, Sarah Martinez closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had traveled a long road from being dismissed as a diversity hire to becoming a combat-proven SEAL team leader. The transformation was complete, and she was exactly where she belonged, among the elite warriors who stood ready to sacrifice everything to protect others. The mission was over, but Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. There would be other operations, other hostages to rescue, other battles to fight. But tonight, 3 Americans were going home to their families because she and her team had refused to accept that the mission was impossible. That was what being a SEAL meant, never accepting that any mission was impossible when American lives hung in the balance. Sarah Martinez had proven herself worthy of that responsibility, and she would carry that honor for the rest of her military career.